Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles, talking about controversial issues in a respectful, upfront way. And today I'm very excited to have my guest on. He is a professor of rhetoric and composition at the Arizona State University with a focus on anti-racism and social justice theory in practice in writing assessments. We're going to talk about language today, and my guest is Asao Inoue. Yes, say that right.
Yes, sure.
I'm so bad at that stuff. But
that's all right.
It's so nice to have you here. Thank you for coming on the show. You talk about getting uncomfortable. You talk about having uncomfortable conversations a lot, wrestling with difficult concepts and things like that. And I think that that's so important. And I'm actually shocked at how many people in the intellectual space aren't willing to get uncomfortable with specific ideas. So 2 episodes ago or 3 episodes ago, I had a guest on named Buck Angel, who's identifies as a transsexual man, born biological woman. And he tweeted out, right here, it says, control the language and you control the narrative. What a scary thought, but it's happening now. And I think that you are a perfect guest to kind of walk us through this changing language that we're seeing so much, especially in the social justice world. And people don't know how to keep up with it because the definition of like racism or violence and speech and violence or definition of even among gender things is changing so fast that people are kind of running to catch up. So I'm hoping that you can give us some of your takes on kind of what's happening and things along those lines. So thank you so much for being here, Professor. This is a really great opportunity for my listeners. Can you just share a little bit about like your background, what got you into this specific niche within rhetoric and composition and things like that?
Sure. Well, thanks, Will. I appreciate being asked to come on your show, and I'm happy to do it. My background, I was a remedial English kid growing up. I grew up in a predominantly Black area in Vegas called North Las Vegas. And then we moved out of that area into a working class white and Latinx area that was just south of there. And when I look at those areas now on a map, it seemed like literally like a different city to me, like what I remembered as experiencing it. Not just experiencing the students, my peers are on the block and the classrooms that I was in and the teachers and just the vibe of the neighborhood and what we felt like. It felt very, very different. And language was always at the center of that for me in my experience. How I used it or didn't use it, what I thought about it, and what I thought it meant when I heard it or when I spoke in a certain way. So I started, one of the Englishes that I started with was Black English, but I quit, but at about 4th grade, right before 4th grade, when we moved to that new neighborhood, it was clear to me that was not the English I should be using, not just in school, but on the block. And I don't mean should as in like it was more appropriate. I just mean that I was going to be judged differently. Yeah. I already was because of the color of my skin. I was darker. I was understood as being Mexican, even though I don't have any Mexican heritage at all. I mean, it would be wonderful if I did, but I don't have any. But I was mistaken. My heritage on my father's side is Japanese. Okay. And so in that context, when there's Mexican Americans and folks of Mexican descent very close by, in proximity, racially, on the racial landscape of America, I get cast as Mexican. So, and all that goes along with it. And that was a negative moniker. It was not positive. At least that's how people would sling those words to me and all of the racial slurs that went along with it. I mean, there's some pretty nasty things that happened, and I understand the dynamics now. I didn't understand it then, as a 12-year-old. But the lesson I took from it was, I got to do language differently, at least because that's the one thing I thought I could control. Even though what I didn't understand, which was what I understand better now, is that while I can control to some degree how I language in the world, I don't get to control how people judge my languaging and me. And that is, they are not necessarily equally equated, if that makes sense. So my background comes from that upbringing and that emphasis and focus on language. I mean, one important set of experiences that I had with my twin brother. I have a twin brother, identical twin brother. One of the experiences that we had when we were latchkey kids, because my mom was a single mother and she was working 3 jobs most of the time during our childhood. So we would be inside locked up, right? Because it was too dangerous to be like, just go playing outside after school. So one of the things that we did was she had this old Montgomery Ward signature typewriter that we would type. We thought it was first fun to type on it because it was like snap, snap, snap.
Yeah,
It just was really cool. It wasn't electric. It was like a manual. But it turned out we started writing stories to each other, like just these made up crazy wild stories. And we would type it up and then give it to my brother, and he would read it and circle things and do stuff like what we thought an editor or a teacher might do. And it was mostly due to this exchange that we wanted to have with language and playing with language and making up stories and having stories. So we did that when we couldn't go outside and do anything else in Vegas, where it was hot too. Yeah. And so language has always been a big part of my experience as a person. And so I, in college and in grad school, studied rhetoric and composition, but focused primarily on writing assessment. And at the time when I got my PhD, I went to Washington State University to study with Victor Villanueva, who specializes in the rhetoric of racism. And I thought that's what I was going to do, was study the rhetoric of racism in the United States. But what I found this really great graduate seminar on writing assessment. And I thought, how can these folks, the folks we were reading, how can they not see that what they're talking about is race? How do they not see that the politics of the English language that is being judged is invisible? That is, they're not seeing the racial part. How do they not see that? So not much of the literature in writing assessment at that time at all even gave much of a passing remark about the influence that race in the classroom might have on how teachers assess and judge writing, how those politics in the culture affect the standards and outcomes that we construct that then teachers have to use in the classroom to do the work that they have to do. And that we often do lots of this stuff unknowingly. That is, we just do it out of a matter of course, because that's what we're either told or we have to do, be out of force, or because that's what was done to us and that's the stuff that we know. Oh, to teach writing or to teach English, this is what you do. You assign stuff, you get it, you mark it up and give it back. And you do those things in very particular ways. And so the difficult thing that most English teachers, I think, me included, and to some degree, although I think I have a very different angle, a very different step into this, is that most English teachers are not their students in a very, very important way. If you're an English teacher, whether you're college or high school or something else, you likely enjoy language. You likely did well at it, at least well enough to be an English teacher. Yeah. And that is not like most of our students. Otherwise, most students in school would end up being English teachers, and they don't. So they don't, but it doesn't mean they're not good at language. We're all good at language. It just means that that affects the way we judge and think about our students, and how the assumptions we make about what we think is good for our students and how they might go about doing that work with us. So
yeah, I relate to that so much. Like, I'm not necessarily, I teach social studies, but like, I'm not a history buff. And I think that's actually what makes me good at my job, is I know that a 16-year-old doesn't give a crap about the War of 1812. So what I have to do is I have to go, you know what, I don't care either. So what is interesting about that to me? And then I have to figure that out for myself. And then I share that path that I blaze for myself to make sense of it for them. And so the same thing goes for language. I think a lot of people who are raised with a very standard understanding of the English language, they're very articulate in that way. It's so natural to them that it's very difficult for them to put themselves in the mind of a young kid who might be ESL or might be from a totally different culture that uses words totally differently. And how do we, so here's a question though. It's interesting because I've taught in these schools that were like 0% white, very racially diverse schools too. And one of the key factors that I've seen of the kids who get out or they rise up, a big factor aside from like parental involvement and stuff, which is big, is how articulate are they? Like, can the kid communicate effectively, even if it's in their kind of own way? But if can they describe things well? Are they articulate? Seems like a great pathway for success, to be able to use the language to express yourself in one way or express your ideas or something like that. So how do we get around this problem of, if we want people to follow a standard English, let's say, in this country, we're an English speaking country, I suppose. So like, if we want people to not be held to this standard, then how do we keep the bridges up, so to speak? Like, how do we, because if we're all speaking different languages, that's just a misunderstanding, right? Like, it's just going to be a mess if like I'm giving you calculations or something in centimeters and you're writing it down in inches. It's going to be a problem. So how do we figure that out? Do you understand what I'm kind of getting at?
Yeah, I do. Let me see. So one thing I think we have to grapple with, both in schools, like with teachers and students, but also because we're in partly what we're talking about are larger cultural discussions, or that we should be having that we're not, that we just assume, like something like a standard, that we all have this, that we have a standard. In fact, we have actually standards, many of them, and they're not actually, we don't always get what we think we're getting, or we don't always judge what we think we're judging. That is what I find. If I was going to judge a performance, an English language performance on something, what I might do, and somebody else equally qualified, another teacher, writing teacher, English teacher might do, they will be different. We will grade it differently. We will find different things important and salient in that. There might be patterns, for sure, depending on how we are trained and what our backgrounds are, and our own idiosyncrasies, like our pet peeves and other things like that. But ultimately, those things in performance, in judging, they're not really the same. Furthermore, I think we have to also have conversations about what my colleague Vershawn Ashanti Young talks about is code meshing. That is, that we're always performing multiple kinds of Englishes and other languages too, depending on who we are and where we're at. All the time in one instance, but we're calling it English because that's the dominant thing that we're using, and that our audience is listening for or viewing for. So I think that we have to realize some of the complexity that to ask for, or to say that we all need this one standard English to communicate and keep bridges up, suggests that we are already doing that to some degree, and that there is an angle which we can say, yes, that is absolutely true. We have some assumptions that we have to make. Like, for instance, what many linguists talk about as the deep grammar of something like a language like English. Yes, we share a lot of that deep grammar, enough at least to go, I can listen to someone an African-American or Black English speaker who's speaking Black English, and I can say, I understand what you're saying, even if I don't have Black English as a language in my repertoire, right? Or that I'm not that. But we're gonna go, oh, I understand what you're saying, or I can figure it out pretty easy. That's because there's a deep grammar that we share. This is, by the way, this is coming from many years of linguistic scholarship, starting with folks like William Laboff, and then later on, Geneva Smitherman, who did some really groundbreaking work in the 70s and 80s on this, still does it today, and so forth. So I think it's important to know that we share some things, but some deep grammar, but there is some surface level stuff that we don't share, and that's what usually gets judged. And that's what we think, oh, we're not communicating because we don't all speak and share the same way, when in fact, that is impossible. It's impossible for someone from Baltimore, for instance, to speak the same version of English that I do, who never lived in Baltimore or Boston or anywhere in the East Coast, but have lived primarily on the West Coast my whole life, and primarily born in California, raised in parts of, or in Las Vegas, and then in Oregon. So, those are different Englishes, because of geography, because of people, because of the folks who are there and what was needed for that language. So I think that we're always in a state of Babel, as in the biblical story of Babel, where, we're always in that state and we're trying to reassemble. But that is a dream. Really, it's a dream in the sense that it is elusive. There's no way to have it, even in historical periods where where things were more limited and media wasn't so wide, and there was the dispersal of languages where it was not so easy. there was still a divergence in language. So I'm thinking about France, and I'm thinking about Great Britain, in which, in those places, the French have been notorious for this, right? Like to constrict the official French language to this thing. And yet, of course, go anywhere in France and you'll find people speaking and using French very differently all over the world, but also just in France. Same thing with England, where you have folks like who's that Dr. Johnson, right? Samuel Johnson, who's the creator of the first sort of dictionary of English, who's wanting to like constrict this, but of course he can't. And they have this. If you listen to the arguments that they have about the English language, which was fairly new in the 17th century. 17th and 18th centuries, but it was really the 17th century. The arguments sound strangely modern, contemporary, like the kinds we have today about standards and about the appropriate ways to speak in public and so forth. They were just more blatant about like what it meant. They just meant you're not smart if you don't speak in the Southern English style near London, the metropolitan English, not the Scottish version, not the Welsh version, not the ones in the Highlands or the Lowlands up to the north. So, and there's a class thing going on as much as geographic thing going on there as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, dialects and stuff like that. I mean, just like with teenagers, having taught teenagers for coming up my 17th year is the slang and stuff like that. I'm like trying to keep up with it. My 7-year-old just came up and he said something. We were watching him. He's like, "That's sus." I was like, "Whoa!" For a 7-year-old, I was like, "What does that mean?" He's like, "Suspicious." I was like, "What's suspicious mean?" He gave me like almost a perfect definition. I was like, "All right, I guess you know what you're talking about."
But it works. I mean, that kind of thing kind of works, right? So I think that's the beauty of language, is that people find ways to use it in the ways they need to. And so, but it also means for folks like us who are older, let's say in that situation, who may not be, we're not in the same conditions that the younger folks around us are, where we think we need sus to, although it's pretty cool, I think, but nevertheless, nevertheless, we see it as, oh, you're trimming that word. It's not, accurate or proper or whatever we want to call it. And so therefore it's not good enough. And we judge it in different ways. So I think we just have to realize there's a really great Russian linguist who says, what was this? My mind is like flighty today. I'm not sure why. Voloshinov, Voloshinov, and he said, Valentina Voloshinov, and he said that language is always in the act of becoming. So he said he's arguing with Saussure about like the idea that you can have a language that's static and it's like the standard, right? And then you can have instances of language which deviate from that because of all the things we've been talking about: geography, people, the things they're doing with it, discipline, stuff like that, trades. But Voloshinov saying, no, that's a dream. That standard's a dream. It's just a construction that someone like a linguist can use to say, or a teacher or anyone else can use to say, here's what I think we're trying to do, but everyone does it slightly differently. Yeah. And so, or never quite hits that mark. It's a mark that's not hittable. So so I think that for teachers, I think that has to beg the question, well, what can we do? It's not like, and what is it? What are the consequences of what we do when we have a singular standard in our classroom and hold everyone to it, disregarding where they come from, disregarding the competencies and inventories they come to the classroom with? I think those things should not be disregarded.
Yeah, like I think that where it's tough is, I think I'm not an English teacher. I taught one year of like 10th grade American Lit or something like that, but it wasn't very good. I think that where teachers are, especially who teach marginalized communities, is they recognize what I saw, which is if I can get this student to be very articulate and get a really good grasp on the language, that's going to give them a leg up. And so, it's like a real tough thing, because you want to acknowledge that this kid has a certain culture and a certain way of language, and you have to recognize that these children are going to be swimming in the waters that we're currently in. If we get to a point in the future where we're able to understand different dialects a lot better and understand different kind of patterns within English better, great. But right now, what will help this kid now is to learn like the standard English. I think that they get like torn. Yeah. They're kind of divided on this.
Yeah, you're right. And I think there is some paradoxes here, right? The one paradox is one that you're mentioning, which is like we know the realities of professions and school and college and so forth, and what kind of English that they're going to be expected to use and deploy in those, regardless of where they come from. And I don't argue that. That is, I don't dismiss that. What I say is that condition isn't fair. That condition is, we all understand the politics of that condition, and that it actually harms lots of people, smart, good people who could do amazing things for our world and our communities. And they ought to be given an opportunity to grow academia, grow professions, etc. But they're not in the current state of affairs. So how do we get there? Like, we can't go along with the system and expect the system to change beneficially for everybody on its own if it's not already there. So I think we have to think, how do we do that now? And it's not an easy, it's a paradox, because it also means that we risk that very thing that you're saying. Like, we risk setting up students in our midst now for what we think of as failure tomorrow, because they don't have the standard English. But I actually don't think that's true. I think that we don't set up our students for failure because we don't teach them some standard English. I think the conditions of the world have already set up some students for failure. We're just blaming ourselves because we're the most convenient agents to be blamed. As teachers, we're the ones who are tasked to do that job for students. But in fact, everyone gets all the languaging that they can handle by the time they're 17, and their language capacities diminish after that. That's what the research shows. It actually shows that in a native language, you can only get native language fluency in a language if you've been introduced to it and start learning it before the age of 10. So after that, it starts to decrease. It's not like you can't learn another language, right? But it becomes less, you're always going to be heard and use it as a second language user or a near or native fluent person. And nothing wrong with that. There's always exceptions, but we're not talking about exceptions. We're talking about the pattern in most general population. So I think that if we understand that, then we have to understand that most students come into our classrooms, if we're talking about high school, for instance, or college, they come in there already with all of the language stuff that they're going to have for the most part. And so what do we do with that? And it's not deficient in any way. It's gotten them to where they're at that point. It's doing everything it needs to do. Doesn't mean that they can't work on it. Doesn't mean they can't improve stuff. Like, I liked your example of thinking about students. I wouldn't use the word articulate. I think it's too loaded culturally, but I'd say their ability to explain themselves, to explain the way their language works, to explain their thinking, to explain the way they see or understand something.
Even their emotions.
Right, exactly. Yeah. All that stuff I think is really, really important. Yeah. I mean, I do like the word articulate, but I don't like the word articulate. Okay. I like the word articulate as in a verb, that is, that we do something that bends and flexes to articulate something, like the British use, like articulated lorries, was the truck with the back end that kind of I like that version, but that's because I think our explanations of things should bend and flex. They shouldn't be like, this is the truth and the only way. This is what language is. Well, language is a lot of things to a lot of different people. To some people who don't have the verbal speech, language might be using their hands. But it's just as much a language, sure. Or it might be hearing. Somebody might be primarily an oral like listener, like they comprehend and learn and do things. That's how they manage the world mostly, or think through things. And some people it might be something they have to visualize on the page, something more visual, or symbolic in that way. So I think it really all kind of depends. So I think, there's a lot of paradoxes in this, but to say that we are shirking our responsibilities by confronting students with an option, that is, that engineering or nursing or science can be done in Black English just as well, perhaps better in some circumstances, than standardized English, we ought to confront folks with that. In fact, the disciplines ought to confront themselves with that, but we don't, because that's not how we.
It's very interesting, sir. Like, you say inflammatory things sometimes to bring attention to like your ideas. I wrote one. You said something like, "How do we language so that we stop killing each other?" Because you want to like make a strong point on this. And I was like, well, how do we communicate in language so that we avoid misunderstandings? Because I think a lot of problems, I talk about politics all the time, a civics teacher, is like, they'll say like, you're hurting children. Well, which children, in what way? Like both kind of sides of the political spectrum have, very different views on what is like hurting children, and how do you even define hurting and all that kind of stuff. Like, I guess if we're going to open this up, and I like the idea, because I had my friend Royal, who's an LAPD officer. He's a black cop in LA, and he said when he goes into like a domestic violence situation in a black community, and he has like a white partner, he goes in and he's like, I can talk to them. Like we speak the same language, so to speak. So like same thing for nurses to try and convey this. There's that element is really important. I'm with you on that. How do we get there without having these misunderstandings where if one person says, something, it's taken the wrong way, and then we end up clashing? Like, the paradox, I'm with you. Just how do we avoid?
I think that's a great question. I think if we're always asking a version of that question, then I think we're in the right space. Mm-hmm. That is, like, as teachers, as students, as people, as citizens, as police officers, if we're always asking that kind of question, then I think we're going to be better off. I don't think that we're in the habit, if I'm being honest. I think we're in the habit of making judgments, even if those judgments are tacit and implied, or like, subconscious, if you will. We hear someone use the word ain't in a formal setting, and we think they're not smart. Some people might even go, I don't know what you're saying. You're not being very clear, and feign a sense of misunderstanding. But I think it's actually not. I think the bigger problem isn't that we misunderstand each other. I think there's an element of that can happen, of course. But I think the bigger problem is that with a language and its grammar comes a whole worldview of understanding things, of seeing the world, experiencing it, feeling it. Mm-hmm. And it's different. In some cases, it might not be dramatically different, but it's different. For instance, I'm taken by an indigenous botanist who, her name is Kimmerer. And she's written, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote this wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And in the back of the book, in like a little appendix, she says, here's my conventions, why I'm doing this in this book, which is essentially a collection of essays on botany and her own children and her growing up and understanding her indigenous heritage and ways of relating to the world, and how it's different from the science of botany that she learned as a professor of botany, and how she's come to take on more indigenous ways with her botany. Mm. So one of the ways is through how she languages in the book. And she says, in this book, I have capitalized words that don't normally get capitalized in science writing like botany. For instance, the names of plants and animals. And she says, the reason I do that is because the capitalization of those plants and animals changes our relation to those things. It makes us think that something that's capitalized is more important. It means it's singular. It's like if I said your name, Will, I would capitalize that, capital W. Yeah. But if I just said a rabbit or a piece of grass outside, I wouldn't capitalize those things. But that is a reflection of, and it also creates relations in our world. That is, the person who's speaking, the person who's reading that, they get a relation. They say, this person is more important, and things should bow to that person in some sense. So she gives the example of boats. We name boats, and they're capitalized, but we don't name these animals and these things, or we don't capitalize them in the same way, because they're not as important in the grand scheme of things. They're there to be manipulated. And that's just and she says in her indigenous culture, that is not the case. Right. We're all part of this whole thing, and we can't. So to disrespect that blade of grass is to disrespect me in some sense, or her culture and so forth. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, in the sense of at least understanding the way we language in the world, even if it's slightly different, even if we don't understand it as a listener or a viewer, it affects that person's, or it is that person's way of understanding and viewing and experiencing the world. And it can mean very real things. So when I say, how do we language so we stop killing each other? I mean that quite literally. That is, what do we think starts all this? Do we think that people are killing other people in other countries, like in Ukraine for right now, because that they want stuff from the other person, that they just want all those resources and things from that is in the geographic area called Ukraine? Perhaps that's part of it, but that starts with making arguments to ourselves and others about why we deserve it and they don't, why it's ours and not theirs possession, why that we are more important than they are, while they're wrong and we're right. And all those things come out of the languaging that we have in the world. It's not just geography and so forth. Of course, it's part of all that. Power, politics, money, and so forth. But it's also, and starts with, I think, the way in which we understand the world. If we understood our world as everybody has the right to that, and I don't have a singular right to anything, no matter what my relations to it, that it's what I got or what's around me is supposed to be shared by everybody, then I think we don't have the same kind of fights about stuff like that, about possession and what do I possess and what do you possess and how those things are different and mutually exclusive. That we share things. Like if we just didn't have that in our language, imagine how hard it would be to say I own something.
Right.
I can, and therefore I can dispose of it or sell it or manipulate it or destroy it or do whatever I want with it.
And it frames the whole way you see the world. You're in this space of directing language because you are in the academy, kind of directing language. If you were, you get the crown, okay? You get to build the field of rhetoric and composition. What you feel would achieve these outcomes. What would that look like if you could have kind of your way of like, how would you restructure the field of rhetoric and composition? Would you get rid of, and I'm not like putting your words in your mouth, but like, would you get rid of the idea of like, you have to do standard English in like law and engineering? Would it be like, how would you structure your field?
Yeah, so my field is fairly diverse and we do a lot of different things. So I'm going to limit it just a bit. How about if I say, if I were the king of composition, that is the teaching of writing, which is a big portion of it, right? But there's lots of other stuff that it does. So I'm not going to try to talk about anything else, but the teaching of writing. I think I would focus, because this is just what I do research on, I would focus on assessment and say, we need to rethink those things. I'm not going to dictate. I just don't think it's a good idea to dictate to anybody. Here, you have to do this, right? And you have to, I might be strong about what I think is good and what I think is bad, what I think is going to work and what I think is not going to work. But ultimately, I think everyone needs agency. Teacher, student, anyone, whoever, they need agency and they need to be able to figure that out themselves. So I think if I were going to, what I would want to do is have all the primary instruction for teachers of all stripes and all levels would be first in assessment. We need to understand the nature of judgment of language. And I don't think we know that very well. But typically, historically, what's the training that English teachers get from? It used to be that we got most of our training as appreciation of literature, primarily one kind of literature. And then it was two kinds, British and American literature. And those are primarily racialized as white literature because they're mostly white from white racial populations and really elite white ones. That's expanded since then, but it's not like it's tremendously different. And when we look at the curriculum and the canon that's used to train teachers, I think that needs to change. I'm not saying we shouldn't be appreciating literature or that we should be reading that kind of stuff. I'm saying our primary focus is understanding the nature of judgment of language. And language is judgment. These things are fairly synonymous for me. So that would be very different training. We would learn more about implicit bias. We would learn more about how the ecologies we create in the classroom around judgment and assessment work and what they do and how we might manipulate them to form or to engineer the things that we really want. or that we say we want. I think there isn't an English teacher out there that wouldn't say, I want social justice. I want all my students to do well. I want them to have full agency, et cetera, et cetera. I think they all do, because I think people who get in this profession do it for good reasons. And they do it because they're good people and they want good things for students. They're certainly not doing it for the money, right? Because we don't make a lot of money. But and yet we would still argue that there's a lot of practices that are bad, or that aren't helpful, let's say. I won't say bad, aren't helpful. So I think that a big part of that is not understanding and having enough training in understanding the ways assessment and judgment work. It is very insidious. I mean, if we just looked at something like the assessment of intelligence, we can see all kinds of problems.
Like IQ tests?
Like IQ tests, for sure. IQ is not the first version of that, but it's near the top. Yeah. The idea of intelligence really only comes about until you start assessing it. So the IQ test and things like that create the notion, the concept of IQ. Now you've got that stuff circulating. That is, instead of having different competencies or different kinds of intelligences, you have one intelligence that is linear, that's on a number system, and the higher the better. So somebody's going to get privileged. I always say that one of the cardinal logics, the central logics of racism is hierarchical logic. It's just historically that's just been true. Race, the concept of race, as bogus biologically as it is, socially it is not bogus, right? I mean, it is constructed socially. We know this, and it's been primarily used to create hierarchies of people. We now have new surrogates for race. Language we can still discriminate against. We can discriminate against in the job market. We can discriminate in graduate school, in colleges, in entrance essays. We can discriminate that all day long and just say they're not articulate enough. They're not smart enough on the page. But that's only half true. It's only true if we accept that one linear version of the standard is a surrogate for all those other things, but really it's just a surrogate for one group, one elite racialized group.
Yeah, it's so tricky. My wife is, she's an immigrant from the Philippines, and she's really, immigrant mentality, like hard worker. She has a salon, and it's frustrating because she tries to hire people for front desk, and they can't even formulate a good email. It's like, and some of them are bright, but they can't communicate well. Yeah. She has to think about her bottom line of if this person sends out an email that's not in whatever proper English, again, swimming in those waters, then it could hurt my ability to employ the rest of the girls who work for me and stuff like that. It's really, really tricky.
Yeah, that was gonna say that's part of the paradox, right? I mean, part of the paradox is that we don't get to dictate the systems that we're in already, right? And those systems aren't fair. They're racist, they're white supremacist, and so forth. And you're getting an example of that. There isn't, now I will say that when we're talking about the language acquisition, language learning, and second language learning, they are very different things in many ways. However, second language learners don't usually get the choice either of which English do you want to learn, right? It's just assumed that there's only one English, it's a standardized one in this textbook, and you learn that one if you're going to go to America and do or you're going to go to wherever and use English as a way to conduct business. But in actuality, that it never works out that way. You use the English that's the Englishes that are localized in your area. There's lots of what they call world Englishes that are all over. And they're different and so forth. So yeah.
Is there a tension, a divide in rhetoric and composition between your kind of camp, what you're arguing for, which I think that I really understand what you're saying here. And I'm with you on so much of it. But then there's the other side that also wants what's best, especially when you're talking about English people, linguists and stuff like that of color, John McWhorter, Eric Smith, people like that. They would argue a very different approach. Is that the paradox? Is it those guys?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of I think the heart of some of those tensions isn't the goodwill and the smartness and the goodness of the people involved. I think take I mean, McWhorter's not, he's a linguist. He's not really in rhetoric and composition, although there are linguists that come to those conferences and so forth, but they're sort of separate. But nevertheless, McWhorter is an important, national voice on a lot of these topics. But he studies language and specifically started with like Creoles and so forth.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's important that like his position is a kind of position that you might hear voiced by let's say a little bit more reserved or conservative writing teacher, or someone in my field who studies rhetoric and composition. So they would say we can't deny there's a standard that is, at least even if we can debate about whether it actually exists, we know that we have one and that the students can learn it or should learn it if they're going to be successful. And it's always this preparation argument. We have to prepare. That's our job, to prepare them.
Yeah.
Now that assumes that we accept all of the premises of the system, like the white supremacy of it, like the fact that one standard is the only one that we should be using. So I prefer, my moral compass says, and I'm not saying they're immoral, not at all. I think their morals dictate the present system has these premises, and we're going to accept them so that my students can benefit. My premise is I want better systems, so I need to change the premises of the system. So I think that we will not ever, we don't get an option to escape the system without damage. That is, without harm. People are going to get hurt. People are already getting hurt in all kinds of ways. We just don't focus on that hurt. We say they just didn't make it. They just don't know the English well enough, so they don't get to have the jobs. But in reality, they could have, I think, in another reality. So I think I'm more interested in changing systems and the structures that make those systems. So like standards and outcomes and how we judge in classrooms. Those are systems that we can change. I don't think it's important for me to say, I don't think that, I don't want to argue against McWhorter or someone who might argue, I can respect all these different Englishes, but there is this English that is a professional English, that is a standardized one that I'm going to teach my students, while also saying, hey, your English is just as good as anyone else's. It's just not being used over here, and I want you to have this. I'm going to say, yes, you may make that choice in my class. As a student, you can make that choice, and I'm going to abide by it. I'm not going to take that away from you, but I want to offer you another political position to take, one that's more socially aware of the future, what your responsibility is to the future generations who are going to exist in systems like this or ones after it. So for me, that is, what do you stand for? Do you stand for an individualized accumulation of wealth and opportunities, or do you stand for an equalizing of opportunities and wealth? I want the latter. I don't want the former. I think we've got to feed ourselves. We've got to pay the rent and all that stuff. Again, those are necessities based on the systems that we have. We easily have other systems that don't require us to think about those things. Best example that I can give to anybody is Star Trek. It's a fully visualized universe in which nobody gives a crap about how much they make, because nobody makes any money, because they did away with that. They said that's not an important storyline, so let's just get rid of it. It turns out to be more of a utopic kind of where people can just go into a job because it's a job they want to do and they want to learn about it and be really good at it. I think that's a great orientation, because that could mean a better community when we're not thinking about how do I get me mine. Like, I mean, it's a real, America, it's hard for Americans to do this because it's so enticing that the narrative of the individual that and I call it a hyper individualistic logic that says what's most important here in this classroom is how well I achieve. What's most important is how well I am prepared so that I can be successful, so that I can get the stuff, the rewards tomorrow. And it's not that those things aren't good when folks can do that. It's that you are just going along with the premises of a bad system. And I'm not hardwired that way.
Yeah.
I can't go along with the
I think that's honest, and I think that, I guess cylinder radio. So I'm always looking at the different angles on things. And I think that these things can be mutually exclusive. I'm sorry, they're not mutually exclusive. I think that they can work together. I think that you can say like, look, this is our system the way it is now, and we got to deal with this. And what kind of steps can we take, even if it's small steps, to try and even the playing field? You know, I'm a big proponent of equality of opportunity. Like let's give everyone the same opportunity, because I've taught kids who were drug dealers, but if they were born in Marin County or something like that, they'd be working for Google. Like, they are really, really bright. They just haven't been given. So like, how do we even the playing field down the road? Like, I think that you can work together within that if both people are like recognized, like you're doing here, which is like, yes, we need to do this, and how do we step forward? You know, you're an anti-racist. I've had some conversations with people who are social justice advocates, and we talked about like critical race theory and elements like that. And I point out the war on drugs is an example that I feel like aligns up really well with what critical race theory was designed for by, you know, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and them, which is like, it started with under Nixon as a way to, it's John Ehrlichman said it pretty upfront, like, there's a way to lock up Black people. The prison population goes up, disproportionately affects Black people. Drug use is about the same, but they're locked up right now. I just go, this is like a perfect example of a step forward that we can do with changing drug laws. And I got back like, no, the whole thing needs to be taken down. And that's so frustrating for me, because it's like, we can't just take everything down at once. We have, like, I think about it like, instead of a demolition crew, what we want is a renovation crew. We want to go in and we want to have one guy with a sledgehammer, but then we also need masons and carpenters, not just a wrecking ball to ruin everything. And I worry about a lot of people in the anti-racist social justice kind of lot that say, tear it all down, burn the Constitution, it all needs to go away, because that is so crazy that people won't get behind it, and then we'll never actually advance.
And it does. I think we have to figure out, I mean, there's a lot to like about that position. The difficult thing that not difficult in the sense that I don't agree with it, but difficult in the sense that in order for us to use that as the agenda for a social justice sort of movement, let's say in language studies and in language arts and teaching of English or the use of English in society, we have to figure out what is foundational that we should not dispose of, destroy, tear down now, that we have to keep up. What's going to keep this roof up? And what can we tear down that is essential to the white supremacy or to the racism or to whatever we're trying to dismantle? The tough thing is that some of those beams are crucial to keeping the roof up. And yet they are white supremacists to the core. So that's the difficulty. So I'm not saying that you're wrong or that position is wrong. I think there's a lot of value to that system. And in fact, that may be the default way that we have to go, like, slow, because we won't accomplish anything otherwise. That is, you know, we won't by just tearing everything down. At the same time, I also know, just historically, since I know the history in other places, never really works. Or it hasn't up to this point. What's worked is complete systemic change. I'm thinking about France and Russia. But what gets reinstalled are systems that are equally problematic and destructive or oppressive. So I don't know, you know, I mean, maybe this is part of the human condition, which is that we are really crappy to each other. We are really selfish and mean-spirited while at the same time, paradoxically, we are loving and we are selfless and we are compassionate. And it depends on where we fall on that spectrum, depends on how much love we have for the system, or how much we are willing to let it go and how much we are not willing to let parts of it go. Again, I think there is a compromise that all sides have to make. The hard thing is that, you know, as I'm sure what I'm hearing you say, and I'm sure you can feel this, I know I do, that it feels like at times I'm making all the goddamn sacrifices and you're not making any, you know, when you're having these arguments, or I'm the one doing all the compromising and you're not compromising on anything. Like, none of your positions, none of your ideas are being, and again, I'm not saying you in particular, Will, I'm just saying, like, when I have these conversations with folks, they're like, so I don't know. I mean, it's tough. We have to find ways to breathe through it all. It's the best way I can describe it.
And I mean, the benefit is just, you know, I think that within your field is you guys are good communicators. You know what I mean?
Well,
So,
allegedly,
I mean,
we're supposed to be. I don't know if we all are, but we're supposed to be.
I mean, the way
we
I
try
keep,
to be.
yeah, the way I keep thinking about it is like the only way we're going to solve problems is if we have different perspectives coming together. That's cylinder radio, right? It's like it's a circle, it's a rectangle. Which one is it? Like it's complex. So to have people within your field come together and discuss, here's where I disagree, here's what you can do. Like those conversations would be super valuable. I think they'd be also valuable to do publicly because as language is progressing, I think your field is at the forefront of all of this, because I am with you. I think and the quote that I gave of my friend Buck Angel is like, you control the language, you control the narrative. And that language has been controlled by one group for very, very long. And we have to be careful who gets control of it next, because again, humans are humans. So like someone you give the same amount of like power that like, you know, these entrenched systems have had to someone else, like why would they not act the same way? And we have to try our best to communicate across these divides within the idea of language, and I think make those kind of uncomfortable compromises and stuff like that. I would be so fascinated to see a conversation within your field of the different perspectives on this, because I feel like I'm not as equipped, you know, like I'm not as equipped to like kind of to break down like really the way language plays out in society. But those conversations would be fascinating to me. Yeah,
for sure. And although, you know, I think in the field, my sense of it is in my field, there's a after about 1985 or 6, there was what most folks in the field call like the social turn in the teaching of writing and rhetoric and composition as a field, more generally, or a collection of fields. And that means that most of the theories and ideas, especially around the teaching of writing and language, turn towards the social. And this tended to be focused on a couple of individuals, one of them being James Berlin, who did some really important work on, didn't really discuss race a lot, but did a lot of work on class Marxism, Marxist critiques and so forth, of the teaching of English and its politics. And so after about the mid to late 80s, it was the field and the folks who tended to be in it and stay in it tend to be ones who have that sensibility towards things like social justice, and thinking about language in social terms and racialized terms, gendered terms, etc. And it's only gotten more and more varied and more intersectional in the field's thinking as a whole. So I think that from an outsider's view, it might look like everyone's kind of a version of me, but I don't think we actually are. There is lots of differences of opinion, and I think that it takes an insider to kind of understand what because we're using like weird lingo and we're talking in our cliques, which I think is bad for everybody. But nevertheless, that's what tends to happen, and it can be difficult to discern. I think the important thing to know is that just like in the field of teaching more generally, I have yet to find a teacher who didn't at their heart start or can maintain in their profession, whether they were in college or in elementary school, that they weren't there because they love people and they want people to be good people, and they feel like this is the place that they can help make those people, even if they're not actually making it. They're just creating conditions that help students be better people. And because of that, I have just an internal belief in the goodwill of my colleagues, even when we don't agree, even when we disagree about like really fundamental things about like what we're trying to do. But I think, well, they don't mean to hurt me. We just disagree about this, even though I think and what they think is like really deeply at the core of our morals and our values and what we think is important to, like, it's going to hurt students or it's not going to hurt students. You know what? That's the in one way I want to say that's the point where I have to go, I got to let that go. I'm not, I mean, and that doesn't mean I'm not taking it seriously. It doesn't mean I'm not trying to, stay the course. I am. I'm in it till the very end, until someone kicks me out. But I think that it doesn't do me any good to get overly bitter about stuff,
No,
or
no.
it doesn't, and then that creates the barriers that I think that you are describing in society more largely, which is you start having these biases and these bitternesses about those folks who do this kind of work or those people who do that. And then you can't ever have a conversation because no one's willing to sit down at the same table to have it. And I think that's important. It's really important for us to do that.
That nuance is so cool. I've had 8 podcasts on the transgender issue, 7 different transgender people, all, I mean, like MAGA hat wearing trans people and like super, blue haired activist types. And you just see the diversity, but they all want good things for the trans community.
Yeah.
And they're so different. And that's just, so I see the same thing here with language, I think, a lot. So, I really appreciate you being here, Professor. This was really interesting. I think that when in long form opportunities to kind of, because you say some wild shit sometimes in some of your speeches and stuff like that, that when you kind of like, well, that gets eyes on me. It's like putting like dang a little bait. Okay, now you got to listen to what I'm saying and break it down. And then long form like this, like I think that it seems a lot more reasonable. Not that you seem unreasonable, but do you know what I mean? Like people just go like, oh my God, what is he talking about?
Oh yeah.
And then, but then you're like, when you are able to pull it apart, I think that it goes, oh, okay, I see where he's coming from, blah, blah, blah. And that's why I think that these conversations are a long form way are just so important. I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah. I think that the important thing for folks, for anyone really, but I'm thinking especially for teachers, especially language teachers, English teachers, I think what has helped me be able to wrestle with these things with my students and with my colleagues is that I have to remember that if we're in that state of Babel, right after Babel, then we can't think that we're going to rebuild it. Like we can't think that we're going to have the tower again, the singular standard or whatever, that it never really was, and we don't get to have it. And so if that's the case, how do we live in this ambiguous world after Babel? How do we do that? And if we're constantly trying to do that, I think that's a respectful, a compassionate way to do it. And we're trying to do those things in those ways, that we're trying to be, I think teaching it should be a compassionate art. I don't think it always is, especially when we have standardized testing and things like that. It ain't very compassionate, but it should be, a compassionate art because we are in contact with people. We are supposed to be attending to the bodies and minds and lives of our students. What better way to do that than to wrestle constantly every day with our students with this ambiguity? That is not to overcome it, but to live in it. That is, we live in the languages. We don't get to have the standard. It's not real. So it's not that we can't see it and understand it and think about it and find out where's my position in it, relative to that idealized construction. But we should firmly keep in mind that is a construction. It is not real. And I should not be judged next to it. I should be judged on my own terms, and I should be judged on the terms that I want to be judged on too. So that might be something else. So I don't know. So I think that it's a hard thing to feel like you're swimming in an ocean that has no land, which is what that could feel like. But I don't think it is. I think there's a lot of really cool things about the ocean. You always want to get to land, but you're living in the ocean in the meantime. And so you might want to figure out how to live in it before you think about trying to get to the island or or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, yes and, right? Not either or, it's yes and.
Yeah.
Where can people follow your work? I mean, other than go to Arizona State, like where can people see kind of what you're up to?
So I have a website that I have a blog on there, and then I also have several resource pages that are static that I update, frequently on several of the things that I do my research on: labor-based grading contracts, anti-racist writing assessments, lots of resources there, and also links to my books. My books for teachers and academic books are free. They do not cost money, so I don't make any money on it. In fact, my last book, Above the Well, that book started out as we charged money so that it could build an endowment. I have an anti-racist teaching and assessment endowment at my alma mater, Oregon State University, with my wife, Kelly. So we started that about a year and a half or so ago, and all the royalties for that go to that endowment. But now we just open the book up for free, and folks can still donate to the endowment if they want to. and any hard copy, versions of the book that people buy like on Amazon, those royalties that I would normally get and that one of my publishers would normally get, WAC Clearinghouse, goes to the endowment automatically. So that's that they can right now. I mean, if you want, you can look them up on online and search. All you got to do is search my name or anti-racist writing assessment, and you'll find those things. All those books that are free. Let's see, the first one, anti-racist writing assessment, ecologies, labor-based grading, labor-based grading, above the well, and then there's a couple of others. They're all on WAC Clearinghouse's site. Then they're totally free to download as PDFs or as EPUB versions. Folks can read them at their leisure.
Very cool. Yeah, walking the walk. Love it. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here. I'm gonna stay on this language thing, I think, in future episodes, because this is a really opened my eyes up to a lot of really cool concepts of how we can build a better society, which is what I think what we're all aiming to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing that folks could do is think about their languaging as judging. And then what does that mean? So it's not simply trying to use something to convey meaning. Meaning gets made in the interaction between the people who are doing the languaging, and in the languages they use, and in the context and historical moment that they're in, and in the media by which that languaging is circulated. I mean, it's pretty complex, but at the center of it is language equals judgment. And I keep the E in that judgment. That is, I spell it like judge and mint, like a British spelling might be. But I'm not doing it because it's British. I'm doing it because I want to keep the person who judges, in judgment. There's no such thing as a judgment abstractly outside of people. People make judgments because people are judges. So judge. So when we language, we're judging. And that can mean a lot of stuff. So nothing is ever neutral. I love the idea. When I was a kid, we used to say, I'm just saying. I'm just saying. Nobody ever just says anything. We mean something by that. So, and I think that's a way to defray or to deflect the judgments that we're actually making, and that we want someone to hear. Even if it's like, I saw a movie yesterday. Well, that says there's a lot of judgments that are made, a lot of premises around those things, each of those words that we can translate in a particular context that will help you understand not just what's being said, but what that person wants you to feel about that other person, and what that person feels about you, in response. So that can alleviate, or that can help us investigate a lot of stuff that we are uncomfortable with investigating in our world today, like race and racism and white supremacy and so forth.
Yeah, that's a whole different podcast. I mean, it could go down that track forever. I mean, it's deep. So thank you, Professor Inoue. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate the conversation. This was great. And I'll probably stay on it and have more conversations about this, because I'll
look forward to seeing and listening to it. So
absolutely. All right. Thank you, sir.